Welcome, welcome. We're going through our estate planning checklist to make sure that you actually do have an estate plan in place and not just a set of documents that's designed to fail you and your family when you need it most. So let's talk about trust. We've already discussed the first part of trust. This is part 2 of trust. So what should your trust include? What needs to be in this? Let's talk about the checklist. Okay, so we need to make sure, your trust needs to make sure that there's guidelines in place for distributions if you're incapacitated. Okay. If you become incapacitated, does your trust talk about how you want those distributions to be made? If you're married, this is really important because do you want to have priority over the incapacitated spouse versus the non-incapacitated spouse? What if both of you are incapacitated, right? This needs to be discussed in your trust provisions. Are there gift provisions if somebody's incapacitated? Meaning, does the trustee have the capacity to make gifts to others if you're incapacitated, or does it talk about making sure that all assets are used for the incapacitated primary beneficiary being yourself or your spouse if you're married, right? So these are really, really important things. Charitable giving is especially a big reason to consider this if you've got tax planning involved but you're incapacitated. Okay, does your trust provide the ability to distribute funds to dependents during incapacitation? If you've got minor children but you're incapacitated, does your trust allow for money to be used to take care of those minor children? If it's not discussed, it's not allowed, right? It needs to be clearly stated, clearly spelled out, or it's not something that can happen. Does your trust provide restrictions on payments from retirement plans? Why? Because if the trust says, yep, everything can be paid out of, like basically the giant pool of assets that I've left behind, that can have a significant impact on retirement plans, right? Estate taxes, expenses, debts, right? You want to preserve assets as much as possible. So these broad blanket kind of provisions aren't the best for you. So it should really clearly state how to deal with retirement type assets. Does your trustee have the power to make tax elections? This is super important if you want to be able to minimize the tax burden to your estate upon your passing. Why? Because if you leave it to the wrong people or in the wrong way, you can have a significant tax bill versus zero tax bill. Again, this is why we talk to estate planning attorneys specialized in these tax matters. All right. Does your trust have detailed instructions for allocating marital and non-marital shares? Remember how I said in part 1 of this trust section that you shouldn't assume that everything belongs to both of you, because the reality is that it might not, right? You might have a business from before you got married. You might have inherited something from your mom or dad. These are not necessarily marital assets. So does your trust talk about allocation of these assets within the trust agreement? Really key. What about personal property, right? Does it include provisions for how you want your personal property disposed? Does it make reference to a list or some other document in which you clearly spell out how you want, your ring, your collections, your art to be distributed to other people? That's what's tangible personal property. Tangible as in physically can be held, like this pen is tangible. Okay. Does it rely or refer to a memorandum, right, for that tangible personal property? If it's not in your trust agreement, is it dealt with in some way, shape, or form, this tangible personal property of yours? Do you have provisions in your trust to offset maybe the financial burden of receiving certain kinds of tangible gifts? This is particularly important if you're at that level where you have enough assets that you're talking about hitting these state tax consequences, but also gift taxes. And gift taxes is something that you definitely want to discuss and address with your estate planning attorney. If they're not talking about gift taxes, if they're only talking about estate taxes, go somewhere else. Okay, all right, so marital share funding method. Do they have a way to make sure that your trustee has the authority to move things over to a marital share for estate tax planning purposes if there is sufficient amount of assets that you might have an estate tax burden, right? Does it allow your trustee to do this, to maneuver it, to plan out, to talk to a professional that's going to help move the funds around in a way to minimize the estate tax burden. So that's it for part 2 of trust and essential provisions in your checklist.